Tonight, new at 6 o'clock. It's been 8 years since Amanda Berry disappeared in Cleveland. She was walking home from a Burger King restaurant where she worked.
And right now, a rally is getting underway at that Burger King on West 110th and Lorraine to remember Amanda. Went missing 8 years ago. Tonight, family and friends of Gina DeJesus will gather at West 105th and Lorraine, as they have every April 2nd since the Cleveland teen disappeared on this date in 2004.
Acclaimed horror director George A. Romero once said, "I've always felt the real horror is next door to us, that the scariest monsters are our neighbors." His quote does make you wonder, what really happens behind closed doors? In 2013, a neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, would realize you truly do not know your neighbors. Your next door neighbor may just be a real life monster. Tonight on Fright Crave, we delve into Ariel Castro and the Cleveland Kidnappings. On May 6, 2013, neighbors near 2207 Seymour Avenue were startled and alerted by the sound of a woman yelling for help and kicking a door. The woman in question was Amanda Berry, a woman who had been missing for 10 years. The neighbors were able to free Amanda and get her to a phone to alert emergency services.
Cleveland 911.
Hello, please. Help me, I'm Amanda Berry.
You need police, fire, or ambulance.
I need police.
Okay, and what's going on there?
I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here. I'm free now.
Okay, and what's your address?
2207 Seymour Avenue.
2207.
When police arrived at the home, they discovered Amanda wasn't the only one there. Two other women were found inside, Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus. Two others who had gone missing 10 years previously. Who are these three women who had seemingly vanished for a decade? And who was the man behind their mysterious disappearances? Michelle Knight was born on April 23, 1981. The family Michelle was born and raised into was a poor one. At one point, the entire family had to live in a station wagon. For the Knight family, showering did not come very often, and the clothes they had were very outdated for the time period. This resulted in her being bullied at school. Making a terrible situation worse, a male relative was sexually abusing Michelle at home. When Michelle was 15, she decided enough was enough and decided to escape her abuser. Michelle slipped sleeping pills into the man's drink and snuck out through the window. She began living in a trash can under an overpass until she met a local drug dealer who recruited her to run drugs for him. He gave Michelle a place to stay for the work she did for him. This would end abruptly when law enforcement raided the building, sending Michelle back home, back to her abuser. At the age of 17, Michelle began dating a guy and became pregnant. The man she was with left her for another relationship, and Michelle was left to mother the child herself. She gave birth to her son on October 24th, 1999. All seemed well for Michelle and her son until the incident with Carlos happened. Carlos was a man Michelle's mother was with at the time. Carlos, who was intoxicated, injured the little boy by fracturing his leg. Michelle would attempt to explain to social services her son had an accident, until eventually she just threw the blame onto herself. Michelle would have her son taken away from her, but she was going to fight to get him back. To regain custody of her son, Michelle had to attend appointments, for which they all took place in different towns. On August 23, 2002, Michelle ran into a man at a local Family Dollar who claimed to know where the latest appointment was taking place at. Michelle would take a ride from the man, but seemingly disappeared without a trace. Not long after going missing, it was assumed Michelle had simply ran away from home, and she was taken off the missing person registry. Michelle's disappearance was merely forgotten about for the next 10 years. Yet she wasn't the only woman to disappear. Within the next 2 years, 2 more women would vanish from the Cleveland streets. Amanda Berry was born on April 22, 1986. Similarly to Michelle Knight, Amanda's family dealt with financial struggles. Through all the struggles her family was dealing with, Amanda was full of dreams and ambitions. She wanted to be a clothing designer and had already begun practicing at home. She kept her clothes very neat and organized. She even had her heels organized by height. Amanda saw the many struggles her mother went through financially and used it as an inspiration to go to college and not be in the same position as her. Amanda had been working at a local Burger King managed by her brother-in-law. And on April 21, 2003, a day before her 17th birthday, she was attempting to get a ride home. Her boyfriend had not answered the phone, and she had argued with her mother earlier in the day, so Amanda decided to simply walk home. On her walk home, Amanda was confronted by a man in a van, asking her if she wanted to hang out with his daughters. Knowing the man's children, Amanda took the offer and vanished. Searches for Amanda Berry began shortly thereafter, and within a year, law enforcement and neighbors would begin searching endlessly for another girl as well, and that of Gina DeJesus. Gina DeJesus was born on February 13, 1990. Gina was a very shy person growing up, with parents who wanted her to socialize more. In school, Gina was placed into classes for slow learners, and was often bullied because she had to ride the short bus. Gina's father would drop her off at school before work to end the harassment. After spending time in these classes, Gina's grades were drastically improving, and she was on her way to standardized classes. Gina had one goal in mind, and that was to be the first member of her family to graduate from college. On April 2, 2004, Gina wanted to go roller skating with her friend Arlene after school. Gina called home to ask for permission, but was denied this because she was grounded after being caught smoking by her parents. The 2 young girls parted ways, and Gina was looking at a 40-minute walk home. Much like Amanda, a man pulled up next to her in a Jeep Grand Cherokee, asking where his daughter had gone. This man asked Gina for help in finding his daughter, for which she obliged. This would make her the 3rd woman to disappear on the same street. Michelle Knight on 106th Avenue, Amanda Berry on 110th, and Gina DeJesus on 105th Lorraine Avenue. What had happened to these 3 women? The world wouldn't know for another 10 years because they were quite literally hidden in plain sight. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus were all kidnapped and imprisoned within the walls of 2207 Seymour Avenue by a man named Ariel Castro. Ariel Castro was born on July 10, 1960 in Dewey, Puerto Rico. Dewey is a small village on the outskirts of Yucca, Puerto Rico's coffee capital. The Castro family was one of the most prominent families in the area, owning the most property. This didn't mean Ariel lived in the greatest conditions, far from it actually. The family lived in a wooden shack with no running water and coals on a dirt floor to cook. Ariel's father would leave the family after having an affair, and his mother left soon after to Reading, Pennsylvania. This left the care of the Castro children in the hands of their grandmother, who had very little supervision of the children. Ariel claimed he was sexually abused at the age of 5 years old. Later on, speaking to a psychiatrist about the incident, he was asked why he had not spoken up about the abuse. His response was, quote, "People who are abused keep quiet, so I did." Ariel Castro started masturbating at an early age, which fueled an obsession with sex. Ariel's mother would have the children sent to her in Reading, where Ariel claimed she began abusing him. Quote, "I would ask God for her to die," Ariel said to a psychiatrist later on. In 1970, the Castro family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where Ariel began school. Ariel did poorly in school. His violent and sexual behaviors began to take a hold of him as he was suspended for touching a girl's breasts and getting into fights with classmates. It appeared for a short time Ariel was getting his life together when he began playing bass guitar. He played in a number of jazz bands in the local Cleveland scene and met a 17-year-old girl named Nilda Figueroa. In 1980, the Castro family moved a mile away from their previous home to 1649 Buera Avenue. In this neighborhood, Ariel met Nilda, where he complimented her on her looks and invited her to a gig he was playing. By the spring of 1980, a relationship between the two formed, and a baby was on the way. The two moved into an apartment together, and everything seemed well, until Nilda gave birth to her firstborn. After the birth of her first child, Ariel Jr., Ariel's attitude towards Nilda began to change. He formed a domineering and controlling attitude over Nilda, and that is when the abuse started. Ariel had laid out a set of strict rules for Nilda. Ariel wouldn't let her leave the house without his permission, and she was only allowed to wear long dresses when she left the home. Ariel also would not allow Nilda to watch certain television shows, mostly programs that featured black people. This is when Ariel began to wait downstairs for Nilda, in case she wanted to leave the home. If she did attempt to leave, Ariel would savagely beat her for it. By March of 1982, Nilda became pregnant again, and Ariel's abuse continued and progressively got worse. On one occasion, Ariel knocked 2 of Nilda's teeth out after one of his brutal attacks. On January 13, 1983, Nilda gave birth to Ariel Castro, but the abuse continued. Ariel shoved Nilda into a cardboard box on one occasion and told her not to get out until he said she could. Ariel was soon fired from his job, which meant he was going to be home all the time, collecting welfare. Ariel then began drinking heavily with his brothers and used Nilda's food stamps to get cocaine. The next few years were hell for Nilda, as the abuse continued and even got worse. Ariel had broke Nilda's nose on different occasions, shattered her rib after he repeatedly kicked her. He hit Nilda in the head with a metal bar, placing her in the hospital to get more than 40 stitches. Punched Nilda so hard in the eye it caused permanent nerve damage. Dislocated Nilda's shoulders after twisting her arms behind her back. And while Nilda was 9 months pregnant, Ariel hit her in the head with a barbell. Luckily, Nilda gave birth to a healthy baby named Emily. The abuse by Ariel continued, but on September 30th, 1989, police finally got involved. Around 6 o'clock that night, Ariel's brother arrived at the apartment to go drinking with him. As Ariel went to leave, Nilda simply asked him where he was going. Ariel lashed out at her by slapping her in the face and throwing her into a wall repeatedly. Nilda managed to escape from Ariel's beating, running upstairs to a neighbor who called law enforcement. Ariel Castro was then arrested on suspicion of assault. Nilda and 2 of her children were taken to St. John's Hospital. Nilda was then treated for a bruised shoulder and interviewed by police. In fear, Nilda did not press charges against her common-law husband. Ariel was released by authorities without any charges. In the early months of 1990, Nilda became pregnant once again, the final time Ariel and her would have a child together. On September 6th, Ariel Castro was born. On December 11th, 1990, Ariel would apply for a job as a bus driver for the Cleveland Board of Education. By February 19th, 1991, Ariel was hired, and on April 29th, 1992, he bought the now infamous home located at 2207 Seymour Avenue. Almost immediately after buying the home, Ariel began installing padlocks around the household. He then turned the basement into what could be described as a dungeon by adding a layer of bricks and curtains to be used as soundproofing. The nightmare for Nilda began almost immediately when Nilda fell pregnant again. Ariel began punching and kicking Nilda in the stomach to cause her to have a miscarriage. The abuse against Nilda continued and worsened. Ariel pushed her down the stairs, broke her nose again, and fractured her ribs and dislocated both her shoulders once more. In October 1993, Ariel pushed Nilda down a flight of stone steps that caused permanent brain damage. On a separate occasion, Ariel dragged his son to their basement and beat him with a dog chain. By the end of November, Nilda began to suffer from seizures due to Ariel's abuse. She was taken in for brain surgery, for which it was discovered she had a blood clot in her brain that hardened into a tumor, an inoperable tumor that would eventually lead to her death. On December 26th, around 7 p.m., Castro began attacking Nilda again, less than a month after her brain surgery. He threw Nilda to the ground and began kicking her in the head and body. A 12-year-old Ariel Jr. saw the assault and ran out the front door to get help. Ariel then began chasing his terrified son down Seymour Avenue as Nilda locked the door and called law enforcement. Officers began searching for Ariel, but were dispatched back to the house. Ariel was back at 2207 Seymour Avenue, banging on the door and attempting to break in. Soon after, he fled the scene when police arrived. Police were able to catch up with him and arrest him at 2117 Seymour Avenue. However, once again, Nilda refused to prosecute Ariel. She stated years later that Ariel attempted to convince her he was going to change, and he attempted to bribe her with a variable of gifts. She refused, but what made Nilda drop the charges was the multiple threats Ariel then made at her and her children. A few days after the incident, Ariel moved out of the house to live with his mother and 2 brothers. Ariel's violent behavior towards Nilda didn't stop. He showed up completely uninvited and began attacking her once more, thankfully for the last time. As the attack was occurring, Ariel Jr. once again ran out of the home to get help. Nilda finally said enough was enough and took her children to move into her grandparents' house. A mere few hours later, Ariel had moved back into 2207 Seymour Avenue. Now he had a chain-link fence placed around the house and installed more locks and deadbolts. Ariel now began to plan to live out his sadistic fantasies of imprisoning women to use as sex slaves. By the summer 2002, Ariel would do just that by beginning a string of kidnappings. The Cleveland kidnappings began in the summer of 2002 with Michelle Knott. Ariel was able to lure Michelle into his home. Ariel had told Michelle that he had to stop by his house at 2207 Seymour Avenue when she saw a sign in his windscreen about puppies for sale. She made a comment about her son loving puppies, and Ariel saw this as an opportunity. He returned from the home and told Michelle she could pick out a puppy for her son. Michelle agreed and followed Ariel into the home and up the stairs. Ariel lured her into a pink bedroom, then slammed and locked the door behind him. Michelle screamed in terror and pleaded to Ariel to let her go. Ariel walked up to her and placed his hand over Michelle's mouth and placed his other hand on the back of her head. He then told her, quote, "I'll kill you if you scream again," and threw Michelle to the ground where she passed out. When Michelle awoke, Ariel began binding her with electrical cords. After he did this, he began to masturbate over her as she was lying on the floor. When he was finished, he picked up a filthy sock and taped it into her mouth and left to get food. For the next year, Michelle would deal with relentless torment at the hands of Ariel Castro. He would place a motorcycle helmet over her head to drown out her screams while he raped her. During the first few weeks, he would do this up to 7 times a day. Michelle fell pregnant due to the multiple assaults perpetrated upon her. When Ariel found out, he hit Michelle in the stomach with a barbell. Over the next few weeks, he starved and beat her until on the 6th week, she suffered a miscarriage. Weeks turned into months for Michelle when Castro began planning on kidnapping another girl. That girl would be Amanda Berry. Amanda Berry was leaving her job at Burger King on April 21st, 2003 when Ariel Castro drove by in a maroon van. Amanda saw a girl in the van she recognized, Ariel's daughter Arlene. She kept walking when Ariel pulled up to Amanda and asked if she needed a ride. Amanda accepted the ride but soon realized Arlene was no longer in the vehicle. The two sparked up a conversation when Amanda realized they had passed her home. Ariel reassured her that they were going to see his daughter, Angie, and they pulled up to Ariel's home. The two entered the house as Ariel began pushing Amanda closer and closer to a wall, and she became nervous. Amanda threatened to call law enforcement when he attacked. Ariel muzzled Amanda with his bare hands and chained her to a support pole. Ariel now had two women imprisoned within his home. As stated before, on April 2nd, 2004, after being told she could not hang out with her friend Arlene, Gina DeJesus decided to walk home. Gina would have rode the bus like normal, but used the last bit of her money to use the payphone, thus leading to her lengthy walk home. As this was happening, Ariel Castro was looking for his daughter Arlene when he noticed Gina walking home, and bad intentions began to grow in his mind. He then pulled up beside Gina and asked if she knew where his daughter had gone. She told Ariel she was walking home. Then he asked her if she could help move a speaker within his home. Gina agreed, and they would be on their way to 2207 Seymour Avenue. Much like what Ariel had done to Michelle and Amanda, as soon as they arrived, his behavior changed. Ariel would go from someone seemingly trustable to a complete monster. Upon entering the home, Ariel told Gina he no longer needed help with the speaker and took her upstairs. The two entered a bathroom and Ariel began staring at himself in the mirror. He then asked Gina to show him her, quote, privates. Gina became uncomfortable and asked to leave. Ariel told her she could, but not through the door she entered through, and brought her downstairs. This would unfortunately not be true, as Ariel attacked her as soon as they entered the basement. Ariel would then restrain Gina's wrist with plastic ties and chain her to a support pole by the waist. Gina screamed and attempted to fight Ariel off, but he pulled out the motorcycle helmet to silence her. Ariel then raped Gina and left as she was still chained to the pole. Gina then became the third and final girl to be kidnapped by Ariel Castro. It wasn't long before the DeJesus family reported Gina missing. Local news stations began reporting about Gina's disappearance, and Ariel became very paranoid. Paranoid to the point he wrote a 4-page confession letter. The letter detailed his crimes and even admitted to being a sexual predator. But the letter would sit in a drawer, not to be discovered for the next 9 years. The local news reported on the disappearances of Amanda and Gina constantly, as detectives searched endlessly for the two missing women. The entire west side of Cleveland was monitored closely by police, and many local sex offenders were rounded up and questioned. Then the stories of Amanda and Gina were broadcasted across the nation through a segment on the hit television show America's Most Wanted. On that night's episode was Ariel Castro, who spoke about Gina and her mysterious disappearance. Unknowingly, her father was the one who had taken her best friend. As investigations into the kidnappings continued, Ariel had then taken Gina and Michelle into a pink bedroom within his home. The two were chained together on a dusty mattress with only themselves to accompany one another. Over the summer of 2004, Gina and Michelle began to bond together. They told each other their life stories and closest secrets, as they were held prisoner within the pink room. The only view they had of the outside world was through an old television screen. The women were not allowed to watch any TV shows that featured black people in them, or else Ariel would punish them for it. Ariel gave the three women each a spiral notebook to use as journals or to draw in. Michelle wrote in her book on a daily basis, whether it be songs, poems, or a list of essential items for an imaginary camping trip. Amanda had 3 different journals she wrote in while being imprisoned. She had the blue journal that detailed the many rapes she suffered, the Miss Shady Hand crafted items book, which she drew and wrote notes to herself, and the black book she titled Love, that detailed how she felt like a prisoner of war. Many nights Ariel would enter the pink room to either beat Michelle and Gina or rape them. While one was being molested by Ariel, the other would hold their hand for support. Ariel began telling Gina and Michelle that he was married to Amanda, and began treating them even worse. On September 17, 2004, Amanda would suffer an emotional gut punch as she watched the Montel Williams show. Montel had renowned TV psychic Sylvia Brown on his show that was attended by Amanda's mother. The episode began with a short video on Amanda's disappearance before her mother spoke with Sylvia about the case. Sylvia would tell her,
"She's gone, honey.
Do you know where she's at?
In the house or under the house."
not knowing Amanda was viewing the whole ordeal not far from the Berry residence. As the months went by, Ariel gave his captives more freedoms around the house. No longer were they chained down 24/7, but were allowed to roam their rooms freely at a strict basis. Yet they were not allowed to use any of the house's bathrooms and had to use plastic buckets that were rarely emptied. Showers were nowhere near as frequent as they should have been, and the girls would suffer from painful bed sores due to the filthy conditions. Then the psychological torture began. Ariel would act as if he was leaving the house as a way to lure one of the girls to make an escape attempt, and come out of hiding to beat them severely. Ariel's cruelness began increasing further and further as he would implement, quote, games to use as psychological torture and seeing who was trustworthy. Ariel would pull out a Luger revolver to play a form of Russian roulette with the girls. He would have one of them place the gun to his head and pull the trigger. Quote, "If it's God's will that I die, I die. I'll say my prayers," he would say to them. The gun was never loaded during these games, but it was merely used as a form of testing which of his captives were the most trustworthy. Ariel would withhold food and toilets as a form of cruel punishment. He forced them to sleep in the freezing basement during the winters, or the scalding attic during the summers. Ariel installed mirrors around the house to monitor all and any activity within the house, and drilled peepholes into their rooms to spy on them whenever he pleased. In late 2005, Amanda began feeling nauseous and began suffering from morning illness. She had become pregnant due to the multiple rapes Ariel had inflicted upon her. Ariel saw Amanda as his wife and decided he wanted to keep the child, whereas Michelle was seen as an object to him and caused her to miscarry at least 5 times over the 10 years she was imprisoned. As Amanda was going through the pregnancy, Ariel kept her away from the other women in the house. Now the treatment of Michelle became even worse. Ariel began starving her, only feeding her stale leftovers once a day. Michelle was only allowed to shower once a week, and he began to use her as a punching bag. Ariel began emotionally manipulating the girls to be against one another. Where Amanda was treated as his wife, Gina and Michelle were treated as less than human. He constantly had Amanda separated from Gina and Michelle, so they all had different experiences within the house's walls. In early December 2006, Amanda entered the final stages of her pregnancy, and Michelle fell pregnant again. For the 4th time, Michelle was forced to miscarry at the hands of Ariel Castro, and Amanda would go into labor on Christmas Day. Ariel brought Amanda into the basement as her contractions became worse, and forced a grieving Michelle to deliver the baby. Ariel, in preparation, bought a black plastic swimming pool to deliver the baby in, so there wouldn't be a mess. Ariel and Michelle were both at Amanda's side to assist in the baby's delivery. As Amanda began to push, the baby's head became stuck and started to lose oxygen. Michelle, with no medical experience, assisted in the birth as Ariel screamed death threats at her if the baby died. Eventually, Amanda delivered her child, but the baby wasn't breathing. Michelle breathed into the baby's mouth and performed compressions with her fingers until the baby began to cry. Amanda had given birth to a baby girl that Ariel named Jocelyn. Ariel then took the chains off Amanda completely so she could take care of her child. This would eventually be the catalyst to Ariel's arrest. Now there was a toddler in the house, and Ariel decided that he was going to give the women aliases in case his daughters were to discover them. Michelle became Juju, Gina became Chelsea, and Amanda's name didn't change. What also changed was that all of the women were now freed from their chains and allowed occasionally to roam the house freely. This only happened because a young Jocelyn had seen Michelle in chains and pulled on them, wondering why Michelle was in this state. At this stage, all the women began suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. Due to the degradation Ariel had forced them to endure, they began to just do whatever they needed to survive. Everyone in the household had become a macabre form of a family. Ariel acted as a father figure to everyone within the house. Michelle said about this, "In his demented mind, he loved all of us because he thought we were all family." That goes back to his fake world where he wanted a family and didn't have it. He always complained how this family abandoned him. In August of 2009, J.C. Lou Dugard had reappeared after being held captive for 18 years. Her story captured the world's attention, and people began pondering if the same thing had happened to Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus. Later that year, on October 29th, Anthony Sawell was arrested for murdering many women in Cleveland. His high-profile case, along with the disappearances, led Mayor Frank Jackson to write a 900-page report on how Cleveland police mishandled so many missing persons cases. As this was occurring, Ariel was fired from his bus driving job and was at home all the time now. He had sunk into a deep depression and became even more violent towards Michelle. The beatings now had become more of a frequent occurrence. Then Michelle became pregnant for the 5th and final time. On Christmas Day, after celebrating Jocelyn's 6th birthday, Ariel decided to attack Michelle, who was 3 months pregnant. Ariel forced Michelle down into the basement, where he kicked her in the stomach with his boot. Michelle begged him to stop, but he continued the beating. 4 days after the beating, Michelle began bleeding and miscarried once again. Around 4 p.m. on May 6, 2013, Ariel announced that he was leaving to visit his mother and bring food back. Amanda's daughter Jocelyn began running up and down the stairs announcing that her father had left. Amanda originally was going to lie down in her room in fear that it was simply one of his traps. In what could be described as almost fate, Amanda's door wasn't locked, as it normally would be. She then walked to the front door and realized it also was left unlocked. The only thing in her way of freedom was a chain-locked screen door. Amanda began banging on the door, originally to break the glass. When it would not break, she was hoping to alert the neighbors. This is exactly what she did, as they began assisting kicking in the door. Eventually, she was freed from the home and went across the street with her daughter to call 911. At 5:44 p.m., officers Anthony Espada and Michael Tracy arrived at 2207 Seymour Avenue. The officers asked Amanda if there was anyone else in the house, for which she told them Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight were inside. Quote, "I look at my partner, and it was like something out of the movies," said Michael Tracy. A mere few minutes later, Officer Barbara Johnson arrived at the house. All 3 of them entered the house with guns drawn, unsure if Ariel was still in the home. Michelle and Gina were in the pink bedroom, hiding behind a dresser in fear it was a break-in. Michelle heard one of the officers yell out police and decided to peek her head out to see if this was true. Michelle saw a dark blue shirt sleeve, so the two ventured out of the room. Espada asked if anyone else was in the house, and Michelle ran into the officer's arms for embrace. At 5:55, officers were already searching for Ariel Castro. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived at a McDonald's located on Clark Avenue and ran into the Castro brothers. The officers asked Ariel for his ID, and then the brothers were read their rights and arrested. Ariel Castro was finally arrested, and his captives were finally freed. Back at Ariel's house, Michelle and Gina were brought out with towels over their heads and taken to an ambulance. Michelle, Gina, Amanda, and Jocelyn all arrived at Metro Health Medical Center to receive treatment. All 3 reported accounts of physical and sexual abuse, but Michelle was the one who was in the worst shape. Michelle only weighed 84 pounds and suffered from malnutrition among other illnesses. Michelle's jaw was badly damaged due to multiple strikes to the face, nerve damage in her arms from constant beatings, and a bacterial infection from being starved and given rotten food for years. By 8 p.m., TV stations around the country began reporting on the case and giving interviews. One notably was neighbor Charles Ramsey, who assisted in the escape, whose interview became an internet meme.
Like to be around people. I knew something was wrong when a little pretty white girl ran into a black man's arms. Something is wrong here. Dead giveaway. Dead giveaway.
Charles, thank you very much.
Dead giveaway.
Thank you very much for your time. And
either she homeless or she got problems. That's the only reason why she run to a black man.
Charles, thank you for being there, man. Charles Ramsey.
By the time Tuesday morning rolled around, the 3 women were all over television screens across the country. Amanda and Gina were released from the hospital that day, but Michelle was still receiving treatment because she was in serious condition. At 11:35, Amanda and Jocelyn had arrived at her sister Beth Sereno's house, with a sign saying, "Welcome home, Amanda," out front. A few hours later at 3 p.m., Gina returned home as well, welcomed by balloons, banners, and stuffed toys. As Amanda and Gina's families rejoiced, Michelle's mother arrived at the hospital to visit her daughter. The 2 argued as Michelle told her to leave. Later that day, police told the public that Ariel Castro was the lone perpetrator of the crimes, and his brothers, Pedro and O'Neill, were released from custody. On July 12th of 2013, Ariel would be fully charged with 917 separate charges. These charges included 512 counts of kidnapping, 446 counts of rape, 7 counts of gross sexual disposition, 3 counts of child endangerment, 1 count of possessing criminal tools, and 2 counts of aggravated murder for the multiple forced miscarriages. On August 1st, Ariel's sentencing began. As an exact model of the Castro house sat in front of the courtroom, media stations around the country began to pack in to broadcast the high-profile case. Everyone in attendance was wondering if any of the women would testify in front of the court. Ariel pled guilty to the charges, but built a case to attempt and get a far lenient sentence, a stark contrast to the death penalty that was being considered. With the case stacked against Ariel, it became worse for him at 11:49 a.m. when Michelle Knight entered the courtroom. Amanda and Gina were being represented in court by family members with statements on their behalf, but Michelle in person would deliver a powerful statement in front of the courtroom. She said, "Ariel Castro, you took 11 years of my life away, and I have got it back. I spent 11 years in hell, and now your hell is just beginning. I will overcome this that happened, but you will face hell for eternity. I will not let you define or affect who I am. I will live on. You will die a little every day." Judge Michael Russo said Ariel's sentence would be a minimum of 1,000 years at 12:38 p.m. The judge gave Ariel time to speak in front of the court, for which he obliged. Ariel gave a 17-minute speech which was full of ramblings of self-pity. "I am not a monster, I'm sick," is what he said in front of the court, as he blamed a pornography addiction for his crimes. With the littlest amount of sympathy, he claimed the sex within 2207 Seymour Avenue was all consensual. Judge Russo said this is the worst case that had ever come before him, and the court sentenced him to the maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 years. Ariel would be transported to a Lorraine Correctional Institution to serve his sentence. On August 26th, the house located at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished, destroying the haunting relic from the city's street. On September 3rd, after a few months of anxiety and despair, Ariel made his bedsheet into a makeshift ligature and hung himself from his window frame. Nearby his lifeless body was a note. It read, "No one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again," from the chapter of John in his Bible. After all of the events that occurred in Ariel Castro's House of Horrors, the three women would write books about their experiences in the house. Michelle, now known as Lily Rose Lee, wrote Finding Me, A Decade of Darkness, A Life Reclaimed, as well as Life After Darkness. Gina and Amanda wrote a book together titled Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland. All three women have been involved in finding missing people. Lily found Lily's Ray of Hope, which provides housing and essential needs for helping survivors and assisting families of missing people. Amanda became the host of a Fox 8 News segment in 2017, which helps find and bring attention to missing persons cases. Amanda also keeps her time occupied by taking care of her child, Jocelyn. Gina became an ambassador for the Northeast Ohio Amber Alert in 2018, as well as founding the Cleveland Family Center for Missing Children and Adults with her cousin Sylvia. The story of Lily, Amanda, and Gina is truly one of the most heartbreaking yet powerful stories in the modern day. These three women survived 10 years of torment at the hands of a brutal sadist and lived to tell the story. One thing to remember at the end of the day is you may truly not know your neighbors and what secrets they may have. Good night, everyone.